Hello, friends. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the 12th episode of Caste Conversation. I'm Pradip Pariyar. Caste Conversation is dialogue to understand the caste dynamics that affect our society, our lives, and our value system. Caste Conversation is an initiative of Dalit Lives Matter Nepal to ignite solution-oriented dialogue for the elimination of caste-based discrimination and untouchability. Dalit Lives Matter Nepal is a social movement to create a just society where every Nepali can enjoy life without the fear of being persecuted in the name of caste. It is an initiative to counter and fight back all form of caste-based discrimination and untouchability. Dalit Lives Matter Nepal is a connection with the people to build a collective force and amplify people's power to eradicate any inequality, discrimination, and violence based on the caste system. 12th episode of Caste Conversation brings you Akhil, who is a Ph.D. student in Socio-cultural Anthropology at Cornell University. His research interests include exploring caste and queerness and how they relate to each other. He is academically and politically interested in shifting the anthropological gaze away from lower caste individual and understand existence and victimhood articulated by upper caste individual because of affirmative action. He is also interested in understanding caste queerness through socio-political desire and law. Akhil has been involved in queer and anti-caste activism and human rights lawyering. He has worked on several projects, including role of men and masculinity in child marriage in India, feminist law, archiving and understanding gender and the sexual in institutional student movement and political formation in India. Akhil Kang, welcome to the Caste Conversation.
Thank you.
Briefly, I had an opportunity to meet Akhil back in 2019, September, in New School, one of the conference, Unfinished Legacy of Dr. Ambedkar. Everyone inspired by Akhil talk, and we also inspire from Akhil. Thank you for that. And then today, we are so glad to invite you here. So once again, welcome Akhil here.
Thank you for your generous introduction. Thank you for your kindness.
Yeah, let me start with asking one question. Could you please share about the queer and anti-caste project, which one you involved on this? Maybe as a good beginning, good to start with.
Right.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you for having me. The kind of intervention that Dalit queers are making, not just in anti-caste movement and queer movement, but generally anywhere, um, is happening in many different pockets all over the world and all over India. So I wanted to just kind of clear a few basics, so to say, before I kind of get deeper into what exactly my work intends to do. So I just want to kind of maybe begin by saying that with Dalit queers, especially, and by Dalit queers, I mean LGBTQIA plus folks who are Dalit and who identify as Dalits. And with Dalit queer folks, especially, there's so much emphasis on the spectacular, and being spectacular also has something to how queerness functions visibly, because with queerness and with people with non-normative sexuality, there's so much emphasis on being extraordinary, coming across as spectacular. And there's also something to say about fabulosity, being fabulous. And a lot of queer people have used being fabulous and using fabulosity as a methodology, as an embodied experience to go through life and talk about any number of issues. So I want to talk about this spectacularity and fabulosity with how there's a very voyeuristic obsession with the Dalit pain. Like, you need to kind of display a certain sense of violence to be taken seriously for it to amount to a legible Dalit experience. And I want to talk about these three things together when it comes to what being a Dalit queer means. So you are kind of caught up in between being spectacular and also kind of extremely critical of what does Dalit abjection means. And there's a brilliant scholar, Saidia Hartman, and she has a book called Scenes of Subjection. And in that book, she's kind of talking about what does it mean for us to be invested in Black pain and to be invested in the Black body to display pain. And I want to take that question on vis-a-vis being Dalit and the kind of violence we see every day being done to a Dalit body and a very gendered violence being done to a Dalit body. So I want to kind of just acknowledge that tension. And by acknowledging this tension, I'm also kind of opening us up to Dalit queerness, because this is just the kind of difficult positions that we as Dalit queers occupy, where we are kind of grappling with so many different sensibilities and different precarities and different complications, and I'm still making sense of these complications. So I just want to kind of flag that I'm not kind of here to give answers about how caste and queerness functions, and I'm also very critical of any kind of gatekeeping around Dalit experiences, around queer experiences, around Adivasi experiences, indigenous experiences. So it's very particular to where I'm coming from, but I'm also making kind of broader arguments about what caste and queerness does to different things. Does that make sense so far? I feel I'm not being too illegible.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'll explore more questions. How has been your journey in experiencing queerness and Dalitness around you and about you? So
Right.
let's go about your own
Cool.
experience. That would be great. So you can go a little bit longer on this.
All right, cool. Um, for me, and in this talk, especially, I want to kind of highlight that caste and queerness for me has always functioned in a way where I foreground Dalit queer experiences. So for me, it's very, very important to learn and to have conversations with other Dalit queers all over the world, and that's where I begin to talk about caste and queerness. And I was and for a lot of Dalit queers, the sense of Dalit also functions very differently, even from within each other. And maybe I want to kind of just quickly mention how people associate with the term Dalit in itself, especially in South Asia, but particularly India broadly, because the term Dalit also has histories of resistance attached to it. And there are also a lot of different linguistic, geographical locations with which people come from, and their different associations with what being Dalit means. Because Dalit is also traveling very differently across India. And that's where I also want to kind of highlight is where a lot of Dalit queers are also coming from, because a lot of us are also situated in very specific particularities of our caste locations. So I come from Punjab, which is in North India, and and I belong to the untouchable caste of community which are called Adharmis, which gets recognized as Chamars in legal and socio-political contexts. And the Adharmis in Punjab have a very different history, have a very unique history, which is also a lot of it is related to Guru Ravidas, who is revered as the guru of Adharmi community. So my sense of my caste came from Guru Ravidas. Ambedkar was much later. So this is where I'm kind of pointing to you that there are very different geographic, linguistic locations and different histories with which all of us even come to identify as Dalits. And for me, my sense of caste and community was kind of understanding Chamar pride and Adharmi pride in Punjab. So it's only much later in life. Uh, I got introduced to Ambedkar only in my late teens, which is which is very late in life. Because these days I see younger people, the kind of access to vocabulary and kind of access to different ways of being in social movements is so different. And like it's only in undergraduate college when I came to know of the term Ambedkarite. I didn't even know about that word. My parents didn't grow up with that word, right? I didn't grow up with Ambedkar. I grew up with Guru Ravidas. And that's also where my sense of caste and queerness is coming from. And I'm also a bit hesitant in uh, people saying that because our experiences are so particular, they don't really matter for larger movements. But I would disagree with that a bit, because despite our, different, despite the different universes that we come from, we are still managed to hold those differences together, and we still celebrate our different universes together, our different multitudes together. And that's where I'm kind of drawing a very affective, emotional bonds with Dalit queerness as well. So this is just to kind of give you a beginning stages of my own understanding of caste and queerness. And as I said, that these are the things that I'm still learning about, and I'm still unlearning about, and I'm still figuring it out. And it's only, uh, in fact, in recent years, I have started identifying as Jamar queer rather than Dalit queer, which is another journey altogether. And without really going much into detail about it, it's just to kind of highlight that 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 the differences of our worlds couldn't really I couldn't hold those differences together, which is why I fell back on my own particularity. So so that's where I would want to kind of begin talking about how Dalit as a category is also being complicated by Dalit queers in brilliant ways. And I also want to draw a sharp distinction between how heteronormative or straight, whatever straight might mean, heteronormative people understand their Dalitness as opposed to Dalit queers. Because I see a lot of hetero and straight people using our experiences to advocate very harmful notions of Dalitness. And I also want to draw a caveat here that I am not interested in gatekeeping Dalit experiences at all. That's a conversation that I'm not interested in, and I don't think it's politically valuable for me as a Dalit queer to get into experiences of gatekeeping, because that's precisely what being queer means. Queerness is all about living every day, figuring out queerness in the everyday, figuring out non-normativity in the everyday, and it keeps shifting 10 million times in each day. Um, and that's the kind of fluidity that a lot of Dalit queers come with. And that's the fluidity that queerness has taught me. And that fluidity has made me understand how I can shift around within my own Dalitness. Now, I just want to kind of quickly point out that in the caste scholarship, uh, especially anthropologists, sociologists, researchers looking at hierarchies within South Asia, in the past decades, there's been a very, very crazy obsession with fluidity within caste categories. So caste also for kind of embodies varna and jati, which are kind of different categories. Chaturvarna, like not going into detail about it, but Chaturvarna has 4 caste orders. but jatis are very discrete units which within each caste order, and they're very differently placed all over India. And there's been a very kind of scholarly fascination with who can move in between these boundaries. And there's so many people who are kind of talking about how Brahmin and Brahminism is not just a lived category, but also a conceptual category, and how it's very heavily guarded through notions of purity and pollution. And what I'm saying is that my entry into talking about fluidity within Dalitness, because of my queerness, also doesn't have to do with that voyeuristic understanding of who is breaking what caste boundaries, because that question in itself is so complicated. That's a very scholarly way of saying it, but also so violent to me to kind of um, determine to what extent people are breaking these boundaries, um, or kind of living them out. So which is why for me that fluidity also has a very queer sense. And this, I'm saying, gets confused by a lot of heterosexual Dalits who use that to make very savarna-esque, and I use the term savarna and upper caste interchangeably, who kind of make those claims which would advance savarna pedagogies. So I'm very critical of that. And you would say that right now, I'm also talking about my Dalit queerness as if I'm responding to a lot of allegations, but I'm not. But this is just to go back to saying that this is just the difficulties with which we come in with, because there's so many differences and there's so many complications that we are not able to handle. And we get misrepresented even within anti-caste circles so much, to such grave extents, that we have to do that labor constantly. We are constantly putting our bodies online, like literally, we are literally putting our bodies online, to online as in, not in the digital, but like online, um, to kind of figure out where we stand with Dalit and queer. Yeah, I don't want to keep rambling. Um, just please
Yeah,
feel free to jump in and.
yeah. Uh, in your some of the article also, querying Dalit, you have written about common Dalit rawness. Would you want to share us about how has that been shaping and reshaping your identity as a Dalit queer person?
Right. Um, I write about um, Dalit queerness through desires a lot. And in that particular piece, I was kind of talking about what does being Dalit queer mean when it comes to loving and fucking and being with people emotionally and sexually. Excuse me. And I was talking about the rawness, in particularly uh, with how Dalit queers are also stereotyped in very casteist notions of how Dalits should be, because there's kind of and there's so many different kind of notions attached to what Dalit queer means, right? And a lot of it has its own history. So let me just point out one instance of how within anti-caste spaces, Dalit queers um, often get translated to being elite. And because there's so much history of sexuality being seen as an elite issue by people who were, say, oh, for us, class matters over caste, or for us, caste matters over gender, for us, caste matters over sexuality. And these things only elite people talk about them because they don't have to worry about caste class. Therefore, they bring issues about sexuality, which is very damaging, right? Because we don't live our lives by, I mean, of course, it's easier for people to live by compartmentalizing their things, and people do million things to survive. People do million things to escape violence, but it's also very damaging for social movements to draw those strict boundaries. And this is often what happens with sexuality and Dalit queers within anti-caste and Dalit spaces, where they think that sexuality doesn't matter as much as other things, as if for us we are, you know, deciding what matters more. Of course, in certain instances, in specific moments, something takes over, but that doesn't mean that everything else gets diminished, which is like a basic thing a lot of feminists have been talking about since forever, and which is also a lot of feminists within anti-caste spaces would also point out. And that's where I'm also kind of talking about Dalit queerness, especially in anti-caste spaces. And that's one kind of stereotype that gets attached. With other kinds of stereotypes, there's within queer circles, for instance, there might be a stereotype of which is also, not just queerness, but also Dalits being dirty, Dalits being smelly, which is also again a very casteist notion of how lower caste people have come to be seen throughout the history, and Dalits being raw, Dalits being very to kind of get the feel of raw fuck, they would come to us, which is again a very stereotyped notion of how Dalits are primitive, right? Because there's another notion of how indigeneity is seen to be something of the past or something people can kind of tap into to experience it. And that's what I was kind of talking about when it came to Dalit rawness. And that's another way in which Dalit queers are also making sense of their own desires and their own emotions. Yeah.
Yeah, right. Could you explain more how lack of discussion or insistence on caste in a household is not a sign of not caring, but a sign of people benefiting from it?
Right. Um, I think the space of household has been really, really complicated thanks to Dalit feminists, including cisgendered hetero feminists who've spoken about how violent Dalit households can be. And this is also in the larger discussion of how there's almost a constant accusation by Savarna feminists that what about your own Dalit men, which is not unique to only Dalits, right? Sabah Mahmood also talks about this in context of Muslim women, um, how how patriarchy or notions of masculinity only get attached to a certain class of community, which is also what's happening with Dalit men, and how households are a very, very complicated spaces to occupy. But what I'm personally invested in is how caste and queerness would um, tackle the notion of household. So, one of the most frustrating things for me when I was connecting with heteronormative Dalit folks in India and abroad was a very, I mean, there's power to this statement, but it's also very dismissive. So the statement being that, oh, you are also oppressed. Like, so this is what a Dalit hetero straight person would tell me that you as in a queer LGBT person, you are also oppressed. I am also oppressed. So maybe we can fight this, join this fight together. And as I said, that there's a huge power to that statement. And I don't want to kind of invalidate solidarities based on different oppressions at all. But for me, after many years, the statement became a bit tiring because we have griefs with our Dalit families too. There's so many Dalit queers who will tell you how violent their families have been, including from women in their own families. So, in that way, there's also a very gendered negotiation with queerness within families that lesbian women, of course, face violence and face patriarchy very differently from me, who not really a man, but I do carry that privilege of being born into the male gender. So in that way, there's so many different forms of patriarchal heteronormative violence that we face in our own families. As I said, that I come from Punjab, and I don't know if you're familiar with Punjabi contexts a lot, but it's hyper masculine. It's very, very, there's so much emphasis on mardangi, masculinity. There's so much emphasis on, what a good Punjabi man could be within families too. And that's been that's been a really hard place for me to negotiate, because masculinity is something which I never aspired towards, because I've always been a effeminate person, and I've always been kind of very so I've always kind of thrived in my fabulosity, and so I just could never make sense of it. And at the same time, when I didn't really care for that masculinity, I started seeking refuge in femininity. But the women in my family also denied me that, because for them, I was not man enough, and I couldn't kind of tap into that feminine energy and vibe as well. So, so the way I was dealing with the category of man and women were also unique to Dalit queer, and which is so to say what Dalit queers are doing in anti-caste movement too. That for us, the binary of man female doesn't work, and this is something which might seem very basic for people in the audience who are people who've read stuff on sexuality and gender, that man woman is not a simple category, it's not just two categories, there are many genders, etc., etc. But the way Dalit queers are making sense of it is also much different than just kind of talking about what Dalit man and Dalit woman means, because the way we are occupying these different positions are also very violent. They're beautiful. They're um, very taxing. They're very exhausting, but also very liberating. And then, speaking of man woman binary, the way we talk about masculinities and femininities also is needs to be kind of thought about more, because there's so much emphasis by Dalit researchers as well as Savarna researchers on Dalit masculinities. Just kind of defining what hegemony means in terms of Brahmin men, or how Dalit men are responding, blah 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 blah. And I would argue that even those kind of inquiries for me are not fruitful, because again that's operating in heteronormative frameworks, because you refuse to acknowledge the brilliance that Dalit queers are bringing to the table. So that's like many points I've made in my statement so far. And finally, maybe to respond to this specific point, I would perhaps talk about tokenism within anti-caste spaces. And there was a running joke like 5 or 6 years back, when I wasn't friends with a lot of Dalit queers simply because I didn't know any, which is also beautiful now because there's so many Dalit queers now, and I'm so happy. Initially, there were few of us who were in conversations with each other, and we would get called by a lot of different forums to talk about caste queerness. And it was so funny, it was hilarious, but also so humiliating, that people would literally confuse all of us with each other. Like someone would start talking to me, and then they'll be like, and they'll tell me, oh yeah, so you were there, right? Like, so they literally confused me to be another person. And they would just like, oh yes, I saw you, so you're from Kolkata, right? Yeah, so you wrote that. And I'm just like, no, you're talking about another Dalit queer person, that's not me. Which was very hilarious to us at that point, because that's just how classic example of tokenism works, right? You just need someone who's Dalit queer to come talk to you, which is great. Like we were it was very humbling to be called to different spaces to talk about this, but also so humiliating, because we couldn't set the terms with which we were coming and talking to people, and we just wanted to be consumed the same way a savarna would consume us. So it was kind of a very, different betrayal within the anti-caste community too, when they would confuse us to be anyone, right? So you are also kind of erasing the particularity and also magnifying the universality of Dalit queers, which is completely antithetical to how Dalit queerness also functions. And also what caste scholarship and anti-caste movements also argue against, right? There's so much grief around universality because upper castes are always universal, and their experiences can always be universal as opposed to Dalits. So yeah, so that's the kind of tokenistic bit I wanted to kind of just highlight within anti-caste spaces.
Dear friends, if you have any question to Akhil, kindly please place them here in the chat box. Please be precise and be mindful on the topic of the day, caste and queerness. I'll ask more questions, Akhil. Can you a bit more about when you first adopted the term Dalit queer as a term of self-identification? Is it necessary to talk about Chamar pride? Don't you think caste pride research what Ambedkar called graded inequality with respect to those considered lower in the Jati hierarchy? So you will talk about that. Maybe
Yeah,
you can come
yeah,
up
yeah,
with
yeah.
a
You
Punjab
are
context. So
cool.
Meena ji asked these questions.
Yes, I'm checking out the chats as well. And thank you. I just want to say thank you for all these questions, and thank you for all the questions that you're asking. Like again, another thing that I face with Dalit queer, it's just that um and I'm talking about my experiences in spaces in India particularly, that a lot of times when I do talk about these things, I either get no questions or I get really casteist questions. So it's just very hard to kind of deal with questions. So I'm really touched by these questions, and thank you, Meena, for this question. And maybe I would want to kind of connect Meena's question with a question that is above in the chat about how there was a question of how do you read queerness within Ambedkar's writings. I'm scrolling, but I can't find the exact words. So I'm just going to perhaps connect those questions together.
You can merge that question
Yeah,
together. Go ahead. I'll put more
right.
questions from that
So
box.
when I, sorry, excuse me, sorry, I just had some food, so I'm burping. So I adopted Dalit queer. Yeah, so maybe I would wanna, I'm kind of just highlighted in the beginning how Dalit was also identified very differently by some of us. And I came from my Punjab Chamar particularity, and my sense of Dalit was through that. So maybe I would kind of just quickly say a few lines on how queer was also traveling differently. Like, sorry to kind of just go through basics. I don't want to patronize people who already know how this is, but I just want to kind of cover some basic ground of how queer came to be. And there's very Western US history to how queer was used as a slang, but taken over by non-normative people to use it with a sense of pride. And there are also a lot of kind of anti-pornography queer histories to pride in US. And there are also a lot of histories of Black queers and people of color identifying as queer, using queer in a very non-white way, because there's a lot of kind of accusation of also white people talking about queer as if their experiences are universally queer. So when queer was traveling in South Asian contexts, a lot of scholars were talking about how people who don't speak English, people who don't speak Hindi, people who talk about being gay, being lesbian, being hijra, kothi, trans in their own regions, how they came to identify as queer. So there was a lot of kind of tension happening within those kind of, etymologies and genealogies too. So how I came to understand queer is also very differently how South Asianists and people from South Asia understood queer, precisely because most of them were upper caste. Because upper caste sense of queer was also what not I could relate to. Um, so because the upper caste also can pretend to be, the upper caste queer can also pretend to be casteless, because queer is seen to not have a caste, right? And that's um, also how upper caste kind of are complicit in advancing caste supremacy. So my sense of queerness differed from that sense of upper caste queer through my Dalit queer. This is so much in one sentence, um, but yeah, maybe that's how, to answer your first kind of query, that's how I came to understand my Dalit queer too, because a lot of Savarna queers started dismissing our Dalit queerness, saying that queer is Western, queer is not a vocabulary that we were grown up with, which I agree with. Queer is something I never grew up with. It's only recently I started associating with it only after politically understanding it. But queer became the term through which I could handle my shame. I could talk about my humiliation. I could talk about so much which other categories were not allowing me to. And I'm not just saying theoretically talking about it, but also politically talking about it, because this is something which I embody. This is something which I live with. This is something which is in my skin. This is something I breathe. So for this is how I kind of came to understand Dalit queer too, and then drew distinctions not just from the Western notions of how queer has been understood, but also how Savarna and upper caste people have understood queer in Indian and South Asian contexts. Um, is it necessary to talk about Chamar pride? Don't you think caste pride reasserts what Ambedkar called graded inequality with respect to those considered lower in Jati hierarchy, example Churas in the Punjab context? I absolutely agree in terms of, and this is what I was also pointing out before, that there are so many differences within Jati categories all over India that I felt for me it was important to kind of draw my Dalit queer back to where I came from, and which, as I pointed out, is also complicated because I have a very strenuous relationship with my house, with my people of Jamars. Um, um, I I wouldn't know. I don't know if I can answer the Ambedkar's graded inequality. Perhaps that's something I should think about more, because pride for me also. Maybe I'll just kind of quickly talk about an instance where an incident had happened in Gujarat, which is now popularly called the Una incident, where a couple of lower caste people who work with the cow hide were lynched and beaten in public by upper caste people, because there's also kind of religiosity attached to cow. And post that incident, there was a lot of articulation of Dalitness through pride. And this traveled all over. This was not just in Gujarat, but I remember in Bangalore in South India, there was a Dalit pride that was carried out by heterosexuals who didn't know anything about Dalit queers. This is not to say that we needed to be there, but this is just to point out the beauty in which pride is also traveling and the queerness with which caste is being understood in different contexts. Um, while at the same time being very cognizant of discrete local jati units. This doesn't answer your question, but maybe this is just me thinking out loud with your question.
Yeah, we
Uh,
have a more question I can ask you. There is a question from Puneet. Are there any contradictions that arise between your Dalit and queer identities, and how do you negotiate them?
Contradictions. Sure. I think queerness is all about being complicated, and queerness is all about being able to hold contradictions together. And perhaps one instance where I can talk about this contradiction is just to kind of expand on what I was talking about before. I was talking about fluidity, and I was talking about how people travel in between different caste categories, which, again, as I point out, has a very voyeuristic tendency to be uh, making an inquiry. So, initially, when a lot of us Dalit queers who were thinking about collectivizing and thinking about mobilizing beyond our particularities, we faced so many dilemmas. The majority of those dilemmas came, of course, from what gatekeeping Dalit identities would mean, because we didn't want to do that at all. But the reason we were so anxious about it was because, it's at least for me now, it's a given that I don't ask questions like, what made you queer? I mean, unfortunately, we've come to a position in the world today that people are now recognizing homophobic and transphobic questions. So for me to ask someone, what made you gay, what made you lesbian, is just like something I feel is stupid and really insensitive. And for me, that insensitivity, recognition of that insensitivity comes from the fact that being queer is so fluid, and experiencing queerness is um, so arbitrary in a beautiful way that it just kind of lets you make sense of so many things very differently. So, because us Dalit queers, at least the couple of us who were talking about how do we reach out to other folks, for us, the sense of queerness was very fluid. And because we held on to that fluidity in, I wouldn't say in a religious way, but we were committed to that fluidity in a very queer way. And because of that commitment, we were very skeptical of calling Dalit to be fluid, because we know how violently that could be used by savarnas. And this was also at the time, this was around 2016, when Rohit Vemula had committed suicide. And for people who don't know, Rohit Vemula was a Dalit student who, um, the right-wing student group had accused him, and the principal of his university, the chancellor of his university, was not supporting him. He did few weeks of protest just before he committed suicide and wrote a letter which is now very in the mainstream, is very popular. And at that time, the government was escaping any accountability towards Dalits, and specifically Dalit students, by arguing that Rohit Temila is not Dalit because he comes from an intercaste marriage. And what happened next was that the government set up, like, this is crazy if you think about it, and it is crazy how the government set up multiple committees, like there were legitimate government committees who sat to decide if Rohit Vemula was Dalit or not. So we were very, and keeping that in mind, in so many other instances, we were very careful of what fluidity within Dalitness could mean and could not mean, and how it could make or break alliances. But our commitment to queer fluidity is what made us understand of our Dalit fluidity, because we could experiment with being Dalit very differently as opposed to heterosexual Dalits. And that's that. And this is just me kind of giving you an example of how we were able to kind of hold those contradictions together, and we were also willing for those contradictions to spill out. We are not here to contain them, we are making sense of them. And in fact, personally, I withdrew from those collectivizations because I couldn't make sense of that contradiction at that time, even though I am okay with those contradictions existing. And maybe I just want to kind of
We
I
have
was
Akhil, we have a few questions. So if
how
you
much
can,
time do we have?
yeah, we have around 15 minutes. We
One
can go
five?
yeah, something like that.
Cool.
I'll ask two questions, and then if you can be brief, that would be great. So could you
Sorry.
say a bit about caste endogamy across caste groups and queerness, and then pride, both Dalit pride and queer pride?
Yeah.
How would you navigate some of the contradiction thrown up by this, but perhaps you don't see much contradiction? Kumud Rana asks this question to you.
Right.
Yeah,
Thank you
be brief
once
is good,
again.
Akhil.
I will maybe sorry. This
We
is
have
just
many
this is
questions.
just the complication that I come from. Thank you, Kumit, so much for this question. And maybe I want to begin answering this question with what's happening right at this moment in India. Because in just the past week, there is a petition with Delhi High Court to recognize same-sex marriage in India. And for people and for folks who are not familiar with anti-sodomy history in India specifically, there has been a recent decriminalization of, um, you know, homosexuality in legal terms, non-peno-vaginal penetrative act. There's been a recent decriminalization of those acts in 2018. So now there's another petition asking for recognition of marriage. And the point that I want to make here is that the petition is being put forth by right wing, upper caste, upper class to middle class activists who are asking for same sex recognition from the state. And one of the points that this petition makes is that they're saying that when LGBTQIA plus folks love each other, we require same protection from the law as intercaste couples would. So what they are kind of saying is that so they're equating queer love with intercaste love, which I have huge problems with because um, because the equation of queer love with intercaste love completely neglects the privilege that upper caste queers would have in terms of loving each other. And the transgressions made by upper caste queers is very different from lower caste and indigenous queer folks in terms of what intercaste coupledom could mean. And perhaps this is how I would kind of complicate your question a bit, Kumud, how queer Dalits are making sense of even intercaste coupledom, because the way we understand transgression and the way we understand being with an upper caste person is very different from queer upper caste people loving each other. This is not to kind of dismiss that so many people go through violence through love, but that equating these kind of two different things is very problematic for me. Even though Dalit queers are not putting these two things separately, right? Intercaste Dalit queer love is also dealing with that. So yeah, I hope Pradeep, I did not
Yeah,
go
yeah,
into a
great,
monologue
great.
again.
We
So
have,
thank you for
it's
keeping me in
great.
check.
Yeah. So how do you define bhakti movements or Chaitanya's relation to queerness and caste? Dipan Chaudhary asked this question to you. Bhakti movement and Chaitanya's relation to queerness and caste.
I don't think I can speak to that
Okay,
in
we
detail.
can go next. Yeah,
But yeah, but
maybe
this question, yeah.
maybe we can explore later also. We have
Yeah,
other platforms where we can ask
right. Yeah.
and share this question. We have a Sibhangi Agrawal asks, can you say a few things about caste structure in North American politics or the North American institutional structures? Maybe now you're
Right.
studying in Cornell University, you can share that out there.
Wow, that's a very loaded question because the Dalit diaspora politics in North America also functions very differently. And I can't speak to it in too much detail because I have been situated in US only for the past 2 years. That's when I shifted to US for my PhD. But maybe briefly, I just want to kind of point out that, but this is also speaking broadly of diaspora politics, that people's sense of their caste associations um, is figuring out in a very, very complicated way vis-a-vis whiteness. And I think that's how I have now started making sense of Dalit diaspora politics in US specifically. Maybe I just want to quickly give two instances from my experiences, which what made me understand Dalit diaspora in US. When I was entering US, a lot of my upper caste queer friends warned me and was strictly kind of had very strict boundaries with white people So a lot of my gay friends, gay upper caste friends who are born American would say that, stay away from white folks. We just like uh, I just don't sleep with them, don't go on dates with them, which I completely understood. But for me, my response to them was that I've been dealing with upper caste men my entire life, and and the kind of um, and the kind of weird and amazing desire that happens with my Brahmin ex-boyfriends, for instance, has taught me a lot about how to deal with white men. So, which is so to say that I was talking to them how they were not realizing how their caste wasn't figuring out in this relationship. But for me, that caste took over race, even though they both are functioning in very complicated ways at the same time. That's one instance where I would say I was making sense of it. And I forgot the second point, so maybe that's
Yeah,
gone.
we
Sorry.
have we have other question, Akhil. Kalyani asks you, it was interesting to know about the aspect of tokenism within Dalit movement. However, if we look into space like university spaces, where have not only worked together, but they are genuinely political representative as well within these spaces, particularly within Dalit groups. If you can reflect something from that experience.
Yeah. Thank you, Kalyani, for that question. Queers have not only worked together with each other. This is, I am really, really happy to hear and to see that queers are getting represented in university spaces. But that's also very hyper specific to few spaces. I want to say that maybe I'll just quickly point out how um, over the past decades, there's also been huge contention around gender sexuality, how there were a lot of gender theorists who were arguing that sexuality is a different framework, so it doesn't feature in gender. But this is also very hyper specific to like scholars debating with each other. But I just want to point out that it was actually queers who were coming from marginalized locations who were arguing that gender, sexuality, and caste and and gender and race and caste and ingenuity or whatever was always functioning in very um, was always kind of functioning in intersectional ways how we embody them and we talk about them. So I am a bit apprehensive in saying that yes, queers are visible in university spaces. That doesn't mean that queerness is being advanced. And I think this also goes to the point how tokenism functions, which which honestly Dalits are very critical of, right? Because we are constantly thrown statistics in our faces, we're constantly thrown figures in our faces in jobs, in government occupations, or whatever. So I am a bit kind of hesitant in saying that, oh, you have two queers in your sexual harassment committees, therefore Dalit queerness is being advanced. Saying that's just silly. And that's precisely how I see heteronormativity functioning. You are not engaging with what Dalit queers are bringing on the table. You are just engaging with what Dalit queers are, who Dalit queer is. You are Dalit queer. That's not the engagement I'm interested in.
Thank you so much, Akhil. This is my last question to you, and then you can add your final thought on these questions. You have written in your blog that reading Ambedkar help you to embrace the emotional within rational. What can we learn from Ambedkar writing and practice, especially if we want to talk about Dalitness beyond the topic around untouchability and the queerness beyond the sexual and gender performance? How can we have a conversation about all these marginalization without speaking in silos? This is my final questions, but you can add your
But
final
that's a
point.
beautiful question to also end this discussion with.
Yeah,
Um,
please go
in
ahead.
my, this is a piece I wrote for Roundtable India. It's called Ambedkar Helped Me Embrace the Rational Within the Emotional, because I was using Ambedkar to kind of break those boundaries between rationality and emotional. There's a lot of, but this is also what, thanks to feminists, Dalit feminists, who've been doing a lot of work on how you read Ambedkar, how do you read feminism within, how do you read feminism within Ambedkar and the kind of work he's done for gender equality and gender equity over the years? What I have learned from other Dalit queers is that we are not obsessed with finding out at what point in history Ambedkar mentioned the word gay or queer. That's not what I'm interested in. And there's a beautiful piece called Dalit Queer and Not Proud by a Dalit queer person, where they're saying that it doesn't matter to me if, Ambedkar spoke of queer rights or gay rights. What matters to me is how I have been able to um, make sense of Ambedkar within my own sexual frameworks. So that's how I am also kind of reading Ambedkar's work retrospectively. And, uh, and there's also a brilliant activist and politician, Disha Sheikh, a Dalit transgender activist, who in a talk recently spoke about how Dalit Panthers in late 70s and 80s were actually arguing for rights for trans sex workers, and they were also kind of making very, very complicated alliances and solidarities with sex workers and trans sex workers. So there's that kind of work that's been happening since a long time. And these are the moments where I would kind of read Ambedkar and queerness together. For me personally, I am not um, uh, I'm not kind of looking into the archives, figuring out where the Ambedkar spoke of the gays, but I am kind of using Ambedkar's sense of inequalities and privilege in my own ways, and that's how I understand Ambedkar. But having said that, Dalit Panthers was doing this work, and I'm not too sure about this particular information, but Disha Sheikh also spoke about how when Ambedkar was litigating as a lawyer, he did represent petitioners who were non-heterosexual, but the jury's still out if this is factually correct. But but that's what I'm saying. I'm not interested in finding out if Ambedkar actually did this or did that. That's just, I think, an awful reading of Ambedkar's work.
Yeah, wonderful thought. If you have any final thought, we talk a lot about this. Maybe can you wrap up with the how can you make all about more allies safe with most marginalized community? That would be wrapping thought.
Maybe I just want to quickly end with saying that you need to trust us. And I am personally willing to kind of reach only the halfway. I can't keep going to Dalit heterosexuals to talk about how the way you are engaging with us is so violent, so transphobic, so queerphobic. You need to trust Dalit queer futurities. You need to trust our sense of freedom, of complications, of our pain, of our desire. And I think it's only then we can have those conversations together. And I want to quickly end by saying that just before the decriminalization case happened in India, I was in a national level meeting where it was all queer folks, and at that time we knew that the case is going to get overturned and we are going to get it decriminalized. And in that room of like almost 200 plus activists who've been involved in this case since a long, long time, I said that once this case gets over, I don't want to pretend that I have anything common with you guys because y'all are upper castes. You don't understand the violence, the legacies that you come with. So let's not pretend that we are in the same boat together. And in that same conference where we met, I don't think I spoke about this, but I want to speak about this now. For me, I cannot build alliances with Dalits if you are transphobic or if you're queerphobic. I draw the line there. I am there for the bigger anti-caste cause, and you don't get to tell me that my Dalit experiences don't matter. Also, I am not a good Dalit, right? I don't care for respectability, and I don't really function in casteist notions of meritocracy either. So for me, I draw those boundaries even within Dalit spaces, that if you are trans exclusionary, if you are tokenistic in brutally violent ways, within university, outside universities, wherever, we can't work together. Yeah. On that grave yet hopeful note, I shall end this discussion.
Thank you. Let's trust each other. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Akhil. Thank you very much for joining
Thank you.
with us today. Thank you so much. It's a really privilege and honor to talk with you. We have come to the end of today's episode of Caste Conversation. On behalf of Dalit Lives Matter Nepal, I want to thank you everyone for your solidarity. I'm also thankful to my friends, Prakriti, Bridika, Suluchana, Vikas, Vijay, for making this possible. I would like to express my sincere thanks to Subha Kaista as well. This is Pradip Pariyar signing off for today. Namaste, stay safe wherever you are. Be aware about the corona. Stay safe, take care. Thank you, Akhil, one more time. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.